Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to part 3 of 4 civil rights lessons. My name is Miss Jennifer Blank, and I will be your guide on this journey. Let's start out with our key topics. We're going to talk about Native American rights, women's suffrage, the women's rights movement and feminism, GLBT rights, and immigration. All right, so 3 key government policies with regards to Native Americans. Now, there are no words that I can provide that will adequately cover or adequately express the depth of horror of the things that would-be Americans did to the American Indian. There are not enough words to describe the terrible things that we did. So I just want to put that out there right away. But there were 3 key government policies that our government engaged in: separation, assimilation and citizenship, and then tribal restoration. Separation from the rest of the country was, and just pushing them further and further west, was the favored strategy early on in our history. And then as we took over the entire United States, assimilation and citizenship then became the goal. And then as we started to come to our senses a little bit, we began to try to restore the tribes as much as we could, despite all the destruction and havoc that we wreaked on those poor people. Full citizenship rights were gained in 1924 for Native Americans, and today there are many different tribes still in existence that enjoy renewed cultural pride, although we eradicated thousands of tribes that will never be reclaimed because there are no longer any living descendants to celebrate them. But American Indians remain the least educated, most unemployed, and poorest of all U.S. ethnic groups. When we're talking about disenfranchised groups and the more vocal minority groups who can get their voices out there, we should not forget that the American Indians are by far the worst treated and in the worst position of any minority group in this country. And with all this talk about illegal immigration, undocumented this and illegal that, I thought it would be useful to show you some graphics. So you're against illegal immigration. Splendid. When do you leave? Need I remind everybody who's ranting about illegal immigration that Americans themselves, well then we were Europeans, were the first ones to engage in such an endeavor. Here's another one. Immigration. Illegal aliens have always been a problem in the United States. Ask any Indian. It's time to reclaim America from illegal immigrants. I'll help you pack. So you can see the message that's happening here. We are somewhat hypocritical in this country when it comes to some of these key issues. And the discussion needs to be modified to something that's useful, not polemic and rhetoric and deliberately antagonistic talk. This is unproductive in our society. We need to start having a civil, concrete, useful discussion about how we're going to deal with the myriad of problems we face. All right, let's move on to the women's struggle for equal rights. Speaking of problems. So the early women's political movements, there was activism that began with the 1848 Seneca Falls Women's Convention, where they reclaimed the Declaration of Independence and actually rewrote it a little bit to reflect how the rights of how women had been mistreated by American society. Women's suffrage was finally achieved via the 19th Amendment in 1920, and then in the 1960s, a different movement reemerged. The women's liberation movement emerged at that point, and feminism came a little bit later. Now, the National Organization for Women was established in 1966 and is still a powerful interest group fighting for equal rights for women. Now, I want to give you a little bit of a timeline here so you can kind of see in other nations when women got the right to vote. Okay, just so we can put it in its historical context. So you can see the United States is down there in 1920, but New Zealand, Australia, Norway, Canada, Britain, even Germany did it before we did. Now, granted, they only did it a year before we did, but still, you're talking about World War I, and Germany did it before us. I mean, that's we need to kind of rethink our views of freedom here. So just to give you a big picture perspective of how we fare with the rest of the world. All right, so there needs to be some important distinctions. Women's suffrage is not feminism, nor is it the women's liberation movement. Women's suffrage was decidedly different. It was almost uniformly about the right to vote and basic civil protections because women were not considered persons under the law. They couldn't vote. They could not take the stand and testify in court. They basically could barely breathe without their husband's permission. This was a major concern for women of this day. Many believed in fundamental differences between the genders and believed in this idea of the separate sphere ideology. There's women's work, there's men's work. It was just the concept that women were just as important as men, but not that they were equal to men. There's some difference there. Feminism started up in the early 1900s and came to fruition in the 1960s, advocated total equality for women. The right to vote was an essential step in this process, but they did not believe in those fundamental differences. They differed significantly with their forebears in the women's suffrage movement. They advocated for economic, political, and civil protections. The women's liberation movement took feminism a step further. There are many feminists themselves, and their goal was to eradicate all sex discrimination and sexism, period. They just wanted to eradicate it completely. So the goal was to change the social landscape, how people saw women, not just concrete legal protections, but actually change the attitude of the American public. Now, the timeline, the dates listed shouldn't be term to mean that feminism in and of itself is over. Matter of fact, feminism is alive and well. But feminism, as it was understood during that period, underwent a significant change and became something different from what it was during that time. So that's why I denote that era of feminism in 1900s to the 1960s, just so you're aware of the timeline. All right, so gender-based discrimination in the workplace. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 forbid gender discrimination in employment, and the Supreme Court also held that Title VII includes protections from sexual harassment. So at that point in time, women started being able to come to the fore and fight for their own rights because there was a legal precedent that they could use to take people to court who violated these things. 9 things to know about Title IX. Title IX is important. And this started because, well, women weren't allowed to play sports, or they were only allowed to play certain sports that were deemed womanly. You know, they weren't allowed to engage in the types of sports that men were, and women's athletic programs did not get the same support, either financial, social, or cultural, that men's sports received. So these are 9 things to know about Title IX. Feel free to pause this and take a look at that just so you have a sense of what it is. I'm not going to go through them line by line, but you can pause this and take a look for yourself. All right, so wage discrimination is still an issue. Recent figures show that a woman earns 80 cents for every dollar that is made by a man. There was an Equal Pay Act of 1963. There's this thing called the glass ceiling where women could only go so far. They would be allowed only to go up to a certain point, and there was a glass ceiling and key executive CEO spots that women just couldn't break. Now women are starting to break them, but as we should be all aware of, there aren't too many female CEOs in comparison to men. And this thing called the pink collar ghetto that was basically women were consigned to specific jobs and could not advance past that. Now let's go on for special protection for older Americans. Let's go on to that. Age Discrimination and Employment Act of 1967 forbids discrimination by age in all but a limited number of occupations where age is considered relevant to the job. Mandatory retirement has progressively been made illegal by laws that were passed in 78 and 86. So older folks are getting a lot more protections. But as we saw during this latest recession, many people who had planned on working a few more years, now their retirement came early, and so they have less money to spend in their retirement because they're unable to find another job after this Great Recession. So it's been particularly tough on older Americans trying to find new work after they were laid off or forced into retirement during the Great Recession. Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 was passed. This forbids job discrimination against individuals with physical or mental disabilities. It requires physical access to all public buildings and public services. There are some limitations which we can discuss in greater detail in class, but generally speaking, you are not allowed to discriminate against anyone on the basis of their disability. All right, so rights and status of juveniles, people under 18. The presumption is that children are protected by the parents, but prior to increased protections of juveniles. But child labor was widespread in the early 20th century during the Industrial Revolution and all throughout that time frame. And it was routine to find small children being thrown into factories and thrown into machines to unclog a machine, and then the child would be maimed or killed because they were small enough to get in to the little nooks and crannies of a said machine. The Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted in 1938 in an attempt to help to back down on some of these abuses. The legal definition of minor does vary from state to state. In many states, it's 18 and under, but in some states, children can be charged as an adult in certain circumstances. Those have to be particularly violent and heinous crimes, and the child usually has to be a teenager in those cases in order to be charged as an adult. Usually it's about 16. There were national voting rights movements that people participated in the 60s during the Vietnam War, because you couldn't vote until you were 21 back in the day. You had to be 21. And the 18-year-olds are like, listen, you just drafted my behind and sent me halfway across the world to fight and die for something that I don't even understand, and I can't even vote? That is not okay. So the 26th Amendment in 1971, suffrage was granted to 18-year-olds, and that is why at the ripe old age of 18, we all get to vote. That is the end of part 3. I hope you learned what you needed to, and I will see you for part 4, which will wrap up our video lessons on civil rights.